So in this video, I'm going to be updating you on the performance for my solar panels for the second quarter of 2024. And I say the second quarter of 2024, actually it's 4 months. We're going to be talking about July as well, due to the backlog of videos which I've had to get through before getting through to this one. Also in this video, we're going to be asking the question, what's next? I've got an A-rated property. What more could I possibly want to do in terms of projects, renewable projects, energy saving projects for my property? Well, here's a clue. It's green. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. Now we'll start off with April. You can see here production was 738 kilowatt hours. It was the worst April production figures by far for the lifetime of this solar panel array. In fact, the production figures were so bad that they came in below the March production figures for 2022. Similarly, we've got not the best production figures for May, 938 kilowatt hours, certainly not the worst. The worst was 903 kilowatt hours on the 1st of May, but it certainly wasn't anywhere near as good as May 2022, where we were just shy of 1,000 kilowatt hours. And June, on the other hand, was very bad compared to the previous 3 Junes. This one sticks out like a sore thumb. 1.03 megawatt hours compared to the best, which was last year, which was 1.15 megawatt hours. So all told, I would say it's about 10% below nominal production figures for June. And indeed, it was worse than the production figures for April 2021, where we got 1.04 megawatt hours. July, on the other hand, not the worst, not the best, 941 kilowatt hours of production compared to the best, which was 992 kilowatt hours. We'll have a look at these in more detail now. So if we look into April, one of the things you can see here is that we've got about 7 days which were very poor production figures indeed. All of these days, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those days were all below 15 kilowatt hours, and indeed 4 of those days were below 10 kilowatt hours. The worst producing day was 5.68 kilowatt hours on the 3rd of April. Conversely, there were no days at all which reached 50 kilowatt hours. If we had a clear day with no clouds at all, you would at least be able to have 1 or 2 days which breached the 50 kilowatt hour production levels. But as you can see here, 12th of April was the best day. If we look at that in more detail, you can see we've got a peak output of about 6.5 kilowatts during the early part of the afternoon. As you can see, the production figures, the clouds started coming in after about 2:30 in the afternoon, and then we got poor afternoons worth of production figures. If we had a good day's worth of production, we would have got the 50 kilowatt hour mark here. You can see that 49% of our electricity consumed was imported, and nonetheless, despite the poor production figures, we were exporting over twice as much electricity as we were importing. Now this import here is all coming overnight, and it's being used to charge the car, and indeed it was also used to run the heat pump as well. Battery consumption was also useful at this time of the year. We have lighter evenings, but there's still a useful amount of electricity which is being consumed after 8 o'clock in the evening time. Now as we go into May, you can see that again we've got some very poor days of production, but we've got at least 4 days worth of very good production indeed. If you have a look at the worst day here, the 1st of May, you can see that 1 kilowatt of production during the later part of the day was the best that we could muster. During the rest of the day, however, you could see that the production rates were about 300 to 400, 500 watts worth of power. But likewise, we'll have a look at the best day, 54 kilowatt hours of production. Indeed, I think this probably beat any day in June as well. 7 kilowatts is the peak production rate. And as you can see, the biggest problem we had with getting even better production was that the battery was fully charged by 1:15 in the afternoon, and then the production rates were curtailed to 5 kilowatts or thereabouts. All told, we could have had maybe 56 or indeed 57 kilowatt hours of production if I had managed the battery here. As you can see, one of the things we do with the battery is that we discharge the battery in the morning time to give us a little bit of headroom with which to charge the battery back up again during the course of the day. This is a strategy I employ when I'm not at home. In this instance, I'm not on the Octopus Flux tariff, so it's of no incentive to me to discharge the battery in the early evening or any other time of the day, and then we can use this to maximize production from the solar panels. So in this instance, we're getting past export limitations by exporting more electricity when solar production is weak. So as you'd expect from May, we're importing about 107 kilowatt hours overnight. That's used to charge up the car. But during the daytime, we are exporting 664 kilowatt hours of electricity. And that is quite characteristic for May. We get a large surplus of solar power during this period of time. Now going into June, one of the things you will see is that there are only 2 days which breached the 50 kilowatt hour mark here. If we look at the best day as an example, the 24th of June, again, it wasn't a perfect day in terms of production. We got a perfect day up until about 12:30 lunchtime, and then we got some clouds coming in the afternoon, and that interfered with the ideal production rates for this time of the year. But you can see here the maximum production was about 6.87 kilowatts. That is a little bit lower than what you get in May, and the difference between May and June is that June is hotter. It does help to have cooler weather when it comes to solar production. This helps your peak time figures, but all told, we've got much longer hours in the day in June, and that does help overall with your overall daily production figures, but not, of course, when there is cloud about. Now, all told, I would say that June, in terms of productivity from one day to the next, was not great, but at the same time, it wasn't bad either. I generally consider 30 kilowatt hours on a June day to be slightly biased towards having cloud rather than sunshine, but you still have a good mix of sunshine in there. But you can see there are a couple of days where production is pretty poor. You can see 16th of June, 16 kilowatt hours. That's your worst day of the month. And I have seen on previous Junes that we have had duller days than this. All told, I'm not particularly worried about peak production rates from my solar panels. There's plenty of evidence that I am still achieving peak production from these solar panels. Everything we're seeing in terms of reduced production rates seems to point towards the weather just simply being worse. And now finally July. Not the best July, but certainly not the worst. You can see the first half of July, it was characterized by quite a number of days with very poor production figures, 20 to 30 kilowatt hours. And one particularly bad day here, 6.5 kilowatt hours on the 10th of July. That was a day that was characterized by having a lot of rain which was coming in from the southeast, and the southeast direction is a particularly wet direction for Aberdeenshire. You can see the second half of July was much better in terms of production figures. The best producing day was the 30th of July. If we have a look at that in more detail, you can see it was an almost perfect day. There was some interruption in the early part of the morning. That is down to a lack of battery power, and this was part of my investigations into why the battery was not working. I had to turn the solar inverter off. Quite annoying that it happened during this time of on the best day that we had in July. Later on, you could see that the battery was charging up. I got it recovered, but export was then being limited down to the fact that the battery was full up, so we were export limited at 5 kilowatts for the remainder of the afternoon. This could have been a much better day than what it turned out to be. Bit disappointing, but nonetheless, these battery communications issues will be discussed in another video. Now, if we have a look at the worst day of July, you can see that peak production rates were about 700 watts. Very disappointing indeed. You can see that the consumption rates were very low indeed for the first half of July, and it wasn't until I got home on the 15th of July that consumption rates started to increase. So therefore, the consumption from the grid was about 87 kilowatt hours, and that compares to 634 kilowatt hours of export. Most of this consumption from the grid, that all happens overnight on the cheap overnight tariff, and therefore this value here in terms of money spent is half the value per unit spent on this one here. So July, all told, is a very good month for revenue generation, which we'll then spend later on with our heat pumps in the winter time. Now, in terms of returns on the investment, so far we have returned about £691 worth of value from running our solar panel array, and we've returned about £80 worth of value in terms of having a solar battery. As you can see, the price of electricity, we started off at 30 pence per kilowatt hour at the beginning of the year. We're now down to 24 pence per kilowatt hour for import prices. So the cheaper the import prices, the less value we're going to get from our solar panel array. But one thing I will say is that your export price is still fixed at 15 pence per kilowatt hour until at least the 2nd of October, which is when my fixed term runs out. At that time, I'm expecting that the export prices are likely to drop in line with the rest of the wholesale and retail market. But as you can see, although we have most of our production ending up as export, that export is worth only a fairly small fraction of the total value of our solar panel array. We're still rendering a lot of value simply through self-consumption rather than export. And self-consumption during the middle of the day is worth a lot more than export. And we still have to self-consume during the middle of the day. I do charge my car up overnight on the Octopus Go Intelligent tariff. I'm not on the Octopus Flux tariff this summertime. It means I can do long distance drives on consecutive days without having to worry about how much sun there is. And that's a major advantage with having the Octopus Go Intelligent tariff as opposed to the Octopus Flux tariff. Now, in historical terms, this year so far is not shaping up to be as strong as 2022 or 2023. I expect this number to probably end up around £1,000 by the end of the year. What you can see here is that we have returned £4,700 worth of our investments so far since I started the solar panel project. So £5,500 is the 50% break-even mark when it comes to the original solar power investment. We've also got the battery on top of that cost. That was an extra, I think, £7,000-ish. I would say we're going to get pretty close next year to getting the 50% mark when it comes to the original investment. So all told, we're looking at around a 10-year return on investment. I can't see the price of electricity getting much cheaper than where it is right now. There's all sorts of upside risk to the electricity prices, but that is going to be a conversation which I will have on another video. So that's it as far as the production figures for my solar panels are concerned. Quite disappointing compared to previous years, but that's the way the weather goes sometimes. In the meantime, I have been busy. This all used to be gravel, and now it's turned into grass. What have I been doing? Well, at the end of my heat pump project, I was left with a gas tank right here. I had to dig out that gas tank, and in the process of digging it out, I was looking at all the gravel that was piling up, and I was thinking to myself, I wonder if that will all spread out over the ground once I've reinstated it. And then I thought to myself, no, it probably won't. There's always going to be some gravel which is lost in the process. And then I also just thought to myself, why do I need gravel in the first place? The gravel was there in the first place because there was a requirement to have non-flammable materials around propane tanks. So replacing gravel with grass has two benefits. Number one, I don't have to pick up pearlwort from the gravel, which is an absolute pest. It takes a long time to do, and it doesn't look very attractive if you don't do it. The other advantage of it is that I think green grass looks far nicer than gravel in terms of how a garden should look. So yes, this is one of the side benefits of having a heat pump installed. This cost me about £200 in topsoil. I got £20 for the gravel when I advertised it on Facebook, and it cost about £35 for the grass seed all told. So a fairly cheap project overall. But is this going to be the only project which I get on with? I don't really want this to be a gardening YouTube channel after all. I don't really know very much about gardening, and there'll always be somebody in the comment section who says I can do it better, and maybe I should talk about gardening a bit more often just to get some more advice. But actually, I've got some renewable ideas coming up. Let's go around the back of the garden and talk about that in a bit more detail. Now, you're all familiar with the heat pump, which I've been discussing through the spring and late winter this year. There isn't much more to say about it, apart from saying that the coefficient of performance for heating up hot water in the summertime is around 2.25 to 2.5 at the moment. I'm not going to talk too much about that. There's going to be plenty more videos coming up about this in the autumn time. What I want to talk about are these fence panels I've had here for at least 15 years. They've been installed by the previous owners. This is a cheap example. Once upon a time they cost £15. Now they cost about 35-ish pounds if you go into Homebase or B&Q or some place like that. And here's the thing. Why replace a rotten fence panel with another piece of wooden fence panel? As my father once said, there's only two types of wood. There's wood that's going to rot, and there's wood that's rotten. My wood burning stove, however, thinks there's a third type of wood, that said. But nonetheless, it illustrates the question, why replace it with another wooden fence panel? Why not replace it with a solar panel? 2 years ago, solar panels were about £180 per panel for a 400 watt example. Nowadays, you can pick up a 400 watt panel for about £51 plus VAT if you look closely. So why not replace these fence panels with solar panels? I've got 3 fence panels here which are fairly rotten. No, this one is starting to get rotten as well. Chances are they'll blow down in the next storm. And I'm just thinking to myself, replace them with solar power, and even if you don't wire them up, it's still a material you can use. In terms of permitted development rights, I haven't seen any constraints in terms of what material you can make your fence panels out of. You can have them as a maximum height of 1.8 meters if it's not facing the highway. And if it is facing the highway, it's a maximum height of 1.2 meters. Those fit within the general dimensional constraints of most modern solar panels which you use for domestic rooftops. So why not use bifacial solar panels down here, which take in sunlight from both directions, and they are vertically mounted. We can always integrate them into a future inverter. We'll go into here and we will talk about that in a bit more detail. So yes, in the shed we do have power, and with power comes possibilities. One of the things we can have in the shed is a solar inverter. I was thinking of a hybrid solar inverter such as Solis, and we can also add a battery into the shed as well. So in this instance, I'm thinking of the server rack batteries, which are made by Pylontech. I was thinking of a 30 kilowatt hour solution. So we're talking about a fairly hefty piece of battery compared to the 10 kilowatt hour solution I've got already. Why would I want 30 kilowatt hours? Well, amongst other reasons, we've got a heat pump now. 10 kilowatt hours is insufficient to run that heat pump on cheap overnight electricity. And as I've mentioned before, there's two ways you can reduce your heating costs once you've got a heat pump. You can either improve the insulation of your property, or you can control the price of electricity. And controlling the price of electricity, I would say it comes out much cheaper. In addition to having a bigger battery, you get additional benefits as well with that battery. Backup power when the power goes out is very important. It doesn't happen very often here. We've had about 3 power blackouts in the winter 2021 through to 2022, 1 power blackout the subsequent year, and no blackouts this winter. But it could all be completely different next winter. Having backup power is very important, and 30 kilowatt hours can power a lot of things. Well, the next benefit of my project is one about bringing the wiring in this house up to the latest regulations. 15 years ago, when I moved into this property, I had a different consumer unit here. We didn't even have residual current devices. Those are really important devices, and they've been around for decades, but back when this house was built, it wasn't even part of the wiring regulations to have it. I got this consumer unit fitted according to 17th edition regulations 10 years ago. But since then, regulations have evolved even further. We now have these things called surge protection devices, which are now a requirement in the wiring regulations. What are surge protection devices? Well, they protect your equipment rather than people, and they will protect your equipment from transient voltages. In particular, large voltage spikes which can be created from things such as lightning. Why does that matter now compared to 15 years ago? Well, 15 years ago, I just had my television, my computer, and that was about it as far as complicated electronics in my house. You had surge protection strips on extension socket outlets, and that's nothing particularly new. But now I've got an expensive car, amongst other things, which is plugged in. I certainly don't want that to be bricked. I've got solar panels, I've got induction cookers, I've got a variable speed inverter in the washing machine. There's a lot more equipment which can be destroyed by transient voltage. So now having a surge protection device is quite important. But in terms of backup power, my thoughts are to have a second consumer unit here, which supplies your sockets, your light bulbs, your cooker, and your ovens on backup power. And you can have a power transfer switch here, which can select between grid supply or your Solis inverter, your hybrid inverter, and run it off batteries. We'll probably replace this consumer unit with the latest 18th edition as well. We'll have the solar panels and the chargers and the heat pump fed from the main consumer unit. We've got this consumer unit sub panel for the actual heat pump here. So in terms of putting these ideas all together, what I'm wanting to do is do this job in a phased fashion. So we've got 2 different phases for this project. We've got the new project which deals with the AC distribution, and then we've got future projects which deals with the actual hybrid inverter and so on. We've got to do various other things. We need to add a switch fuse isolator next to the DNO cutout. We need to upgrade the cabling to 25 square millimeters. At the moment it's 16 square millimeters, in spite of the fact that we've got a 100 amp fuse. 16 square millimeters is only good for 80 amps when clipped direct according to the wiring regs. Putting the new second consumer unit is going to be a bit of a job. That's going to be a job which my electrician is going to quote for. We're going to add a surge protector, and then of course we're going to have an MCB going to a changeover switch which supplies this emergency power board. And that sets us up nicely for the hybrid inverter, where we connect the grid supply from a new circuit breaker connected in the shed, and we then connect the EPS supply outlet to the changeover switch as before. This hybrid inverter, this is it. It's a Solis hybrid inverter, 6 kilowatt rated output, but it is 5 kilowatts on the EPS output. You can see the total demand from all of this. If it was all to run at the same time, that would all be greater than 5 kilowatts. When you're running the cooker, you can run the oven as well. That's no problem on 5 kilowatts, but you wouldn't want to be able to run a kettle at the same time. That would be an additional 3 kilowatts on top of 4 kilowatts. So you'd have to be careful. There is overload protection on here. Oh yes, we also need an earth rod as well. That also needs to be added in. So as you can see here on the safety warnings, you cannot have parallel inverters running in terms of the backup port. You can on the grid port, but when it comes to the solar edge inverter, that is not a grid forming inverter. That is a grid following inverter. That's a little bit different. This warning applies to grid forming inverters. Why is this a problem with grid forming inverters? Well, the waveform they create can and most likely will be out of phase. And when you have out of sync generators connected to the same switchboard, you get short circuit currents, and that creates damage. And that's why this is not allowed. But when it comes to grid following inverters, that might be permitted, but I'm assuming it's not. The other thing, if we go back to here, the heat pump is not part of the EPS power supply. We've got all sorts of issues in relation to the backup heater that can upset and potentially overload the Solis inverter. We've got starting currents as well that need to be considered. I'm going to assume that the advice is not to have this connected to an off-grid solution unless you've got a minimum rated power supply. So for the time being, my heat pump is just going to be on main power, and my backup heating is going to be my wood burning stove, which is acceptable, except for the fact that maybe I want to get rid of my wood burning stove in the future and add some more solar panels to my rooftop. That is a consideration, but wood burning stoves work very well in a blackout situation. Now, the other thing we need to consider is that the inverter needs to have information about import-export. So we need to have a CT clamp, and we need to connect that CT clamp all the way from the main cupboard to the shed where the inverter is. And then we've got the whole systems integration where we need to somehow tell the solar edge inverter that the hybrid inverter is generating electricity and vice versa. This is where systems integration comes into effect. Chances are Barry's not going to be doing that. That's going to be my problem to solve. And this is where my Raspberry Pi will come in handy. And all the discussions we've had about Modbus interfacing with the solar edge inverter, potentially that will also apply to the Solis inverter as well. So lots of projects to consider. Is there any return on investment here? I haven't even considered it. From my perspective, this is purely going to be a hobby, and it's all about asking the question, what is possible in a domestic environment? And there's a lot in that hobby which is technical in relation to Modbus interfacing, making systems integration. All of these things are going to be quite exciting things which I want to consider in the future. Well, that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to be doing something somewhat different. We're going to be reviewing a new accessory for my camera that I have just got. This is an external microphone. It's made by Röder, and we're also going to be considering the DJI Osmo Mobile 6, and we're going to be adding those together with an iPhone, and we're going to see how it compares with my existing camera setup. We're going to go onto my local hill on a windy day, and we'll see how the performance of a muffler like this on top of a microphone fares compared to the existing microphones, which get somewhat peaked out by moderate winds. So that's coming up. In terms of renewable power and so on, and electricity, I want to have another discussion about the price of electricity. I do these discussions about once a year. They're quite popular, and I've got my own perspective as to how things are likely to be trending. There's a lot of research to do in the meantime before that happens, so that is going to be coming up fairly soon. So in the meantime, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again very soon.